everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. Welcome to the webinar on sex worker-centered harm reduction. It looks like we have a few folks getting still signing on, but we're going to go ahead and get started since it's just about 4 p.m. Great. So thank you all for joining the webinar today. We know that there's tons of virtual calls and events, and we're all exhausted of those, but we really appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us here today. My name is Kirsten Forseth, and I'm on the drug user health team at NASTAD. We are super excited to be hosting this webinar, which will be facilitated by Justice Rivera of Reframe Health and Justice. I've known Justice for a little while. I've known Reframe Health and Justice's work. They are super knowledgeable, brilliant people working on a variety of social justice issues and creating harm reduction responses. So very excited to have them with us today. And this webinar will also feature speakers from Sex Workers Outreach Project USA, Spark Women's Center, and the Rocky Mountain Sex Worker Coalition. I do want to acknowledge that this webinar is happening through the National Harm Reduction Technical Assistance Center, which is funded through a cooperative agreement by the CDC. And as always, we are really grateful to our CDC partners and colleagues for their support of the TA Center and this webinar, and also in general for their support of syringe services programs and harm reduction efforts across the country. So I'm going to say a little bit more about NASTAD first, and then I'm going to pass it over to Justice. For those who aren't familiar, we really kind of go by the name NASTAD now, but the acronym does stand for the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. We got started in the early 90s and are a nonprofit, nonpartisan national association who represents public health officials administering HIV and hepatitis programs. So we do work across all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and other CDC-funded jurisdictions. And our mission is to end the intersecting epidemics of HIV, viral hepatitis, and related conditions, mainly through strengthening governmental public health, doing advocacy, capacity building, and of course with a core value of social justice. One unique thing about our work on the drug user health team is that not only do we work with state and territorial health departments, but we also work with community-based organizations. Any program that is already providing harm reduction services and syringe services or is interested in doing so. So we are really happy to kind of play that role between governmental public health and community-based organizations. And more, I'd say in the last 5 years or so, NASTAD has really invested in drug user health and in harm reduction approaches, including sex worker-centered harm reduction, recognizing that we're not going to reach our mission of a world free of HIV and viral hepatitis if we don't truly invest in those communities. Okay, and I will now pass it over to Justice.
Awesome, thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be here. I previously worked with NASTAD as the Drug User Health Fellow, and actually this picture was taken in my cubicle at the former offices, so that's kind of funny. And currently I am a partner with Reframe Health and Justice Consulting. We are a group of queer and trans consultants of color who work to provide holistic harm reduction solutions to social injustices. And we do that through capacity building assistance, policy advocacy, community-based research, and organizational development. So please check us out. We're here for all your organizational needs. And we are one of the few national organizations who provide capacity building assistance related to sex worker-centered harm reduction, as do some of the amazing panelists who are going to be joining me later, especially in a local context. So we look forward to providing a bunch of different resources for you all. And then finally, one of the things I'm excited to tell you about is that I am a current Soros Justice Fellow through the Open Society Foundations, where I'm working on a book. It's actually 2 books, a memoir and an anthology that discusses the need for anti-carceral approaches to sex work, sex trafficking, drug use, and healing. So please keep an eye out for trigger warning in 2021. Next slide, please. So what are we going to be talking about today? This is a really big topic that we are going to be doing a deep dive into. So it's going to be simultaneously brief and very dense. And so I'm excited that you all are joining us for this topic. And so really what we're going to be doing is discussing harm reduction as applied to sex work, which includes big HR, the philosophies of harm reduction, and little HR, all the interventions and kind of how-tos. And we're going to be discussing how we apply these in overlapping activities and overlapping populations, because we know a lot of times that your HIV prevention programs and your drug user health programs are already serving sex workers and sex workers who use drugs. So we're going to be talking about those interventions and exploring different types of services and partnerships that can advance sex worker health. And so this is for all types of different audiences. If you're already doing this work, we're excited. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in doing this work, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is how sometimes we can do this in a one-stop shop model, and sometimes it's through partnership and resourcing others doing the work. And there's a lot of different ways this can work. So that's the purpose of this webinar today. Next slide, please. And this is our agenda. We're going to start by doing some of the virtual grounding. This is really kind of an experience, right, where we're all together virtually, which has a lot of benefits. And so we're going to take a moment to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about what harm reduction is and looks like as applied to the sex trade. This topic can take a whole day or several to really learn a lot of the nuts and bolts. And so this is an overview of some of those mechanics. But you all, many of you are already experts in harm reduction, so it's really just kind of learning how to shift gears or expand that knowledge. And then we're going to hear from some amazing panelists from SWAP USA and Spark Center and the Chrysalis House / Rocky Mountain Sex Worker Coalition, who are going to tell us about some of their programmatic models and how they view sex worker-centered harm reduction and how they do it. And then we'll have time for Q&A, which is going to be awesome. Next slide, please. So we really want to engage you all as much as possible. The limitations of this webinar are that it's only in English today. It's a 75-minute webinar that doesn't have a break. However, we do encourage you all to get your access needs however that looks. So I don't think any of your cameras are on through this software, but please feel free to come and go as you please. This will be recorded. And if you'd like to take a moment and introduce yourself and your program in the chat, we'd really love to hear from you. We do have some polls. We'll ask a couple questions of you coming up here in a second. And know that we really want this information to go viral, and just request that we look at the lineage of our harm reduction information. I promise you it didn't start here with me. As many of you know, harm reduction is a bunch of practices that the most marginalized folks have done for eras before us. And so just really being able to recognize that lineage is really important. It's kind of helpful that our stuff is branded, but just wanted to say that moving forward. And also finally that though we will be providing information about wellness services for people who are criminalized, I am not a medical professional or a legal professional. One of our panelists has a therapist license. Other than that, we are here as community-based members to talk about community-based services and give you resources so you can learn more from that lens. Next slide, please. All right, so we'd love to hear a little bit from you all. So you'll see that you have a drop-down poll, and if you go to the where do you reside, you will be able to click an option here. So West Coast includes Southwest and Northwest, and then Midwest. South includes Mid-Atlantic, and East Coast is both South, East, and Northeast. And so I'm going to give everyone about 20 more seconds to respond, and then we're going to use our really cool high-tech polling feature here to see who is joining us.
This is Kirsten. It's kind of cool because I've never launched a poll before on a webinar, but we can see that about 80% of people have voted so far. So a few more seconds to get your vote in.
Okay. So yeah, look at that. This is super cool. So yeah, look at the coast we're representing, and then we see a really equal distribution of folks from the Midwest and the South. So it's really awesome to have national representation on the webinar today. So thank you all so much. We have another poll for you here. So this next question asks about what you would like to learn about or why you're here today. And you have a couple options to choose from what your interest in this topic is. And so I think it's multiple choice, which is really awesome. And so if you are interested in learning more about sex worker-centered harm reduction data and messaging that is related to HIV prevention, overdose prevention, violence prevention, to be able to bring forward and scale out programming, that's one question. And if you're here because you would like to offer resources to people in the sex trade, that could be financial or material, that's another option. And then if you're here to learn more about specific interventions and partnerships and models and how to engage with community, that's another option. And so again, I think it's multiple choice, and I'll give you another like 20 seconds here to fill this in. Okay, I can see that 78% of people have voted. 79, maybe we'll make it to 80. Or not, let's go ahead and close the poll and see. Okay, so there's a heavy interest in data and messaging. I understand that since a lot of our audience is governmental public health, that's going to be really important. Also for advocacy, we know that's really important. And then figuring out how to distribute resources is also, and then really looking at interventions and partnerships, which we are going to cover all of this today. So it's good to know where to focus, and thank you for engaging with these polls. So we're going to move on. Next slide, please. And do a quick overview of sex worker-centered harm reduction. Next slide, please. So to start, let's talk about a common definition of sex work, especially because I think from a lens of the war on drugs, which is now continued and perpetuated through the war on trafficking, all I know as someone who's even 34 years old is things through that lens, right? And so media is generally bombarding me with ideas of what this is. And so we all grew up with different ideas of this. And so we really want to have a common definition here. And I brought this forward through the Sex Worker Outreach Project Chicago, which is a chapter of one of the organizations that we're going to be hearing from later. And so they tell us that sex work is a commercial exchange of a sexual service for money or other benefits like housing, transportation, and other survival needs. So it doesn't have to be for money, and it doesn't have to be a specific sexual service. And so it's important to recognize that the sex trade is really vast. Just like if I were to tell you that I use drugs, you wouldn't know what drugs those were or how I use them, where I use them. There's a lot of other context there because it's a really wide activity and could mean a lot of things. And sex work is the same. It's really an umbrella term for a large industry. And we know that a lot of people might not identify what they're doing as income generating or identify as sex workers. And a lot of times we call that survival sex work, which is folks who are experiencing poverty who are doing what they need to do to survive, but might not be generally seen it that way. We know that it's used to refer to a broad range of transactions. So there's many different types of sex work. There's many different activities that could count as sex work. There's a lot of discussion about this. A lot of people might call themselves erotic professionals even now to talk about the distinctions in the work. But we're talking about stripping and camming, people who are specializing in kink, street-based sex workers. There's all sorts of different sex work. And it's used to refer to people of all genders, ages, and backgrounds who are involved in the sex trade. A lot of times there can be a focus on femmes and women in the sex trade, but we know that men and boys also participate in the sex trade, a lot of transgender individuals. And so really we're talking about everyone, and it's important to recognize that everyone needs to be included when we're thinking about tailoring services. And sex work is a term that's been adopted by different labor and human rights organizations, which is really exciting because it is a rights-based term. Prostitution is a charge that people are given. It's squarely within a criminal legal context, although many participants might know themselves as prostitutes, and so it's important to recognize what the local language is and the local context is. The better practice in terms of public health and human rights organizations is to say sex work right now. Next slide, please. And a foundational element of sex work that's really important to know in terms of service provision is that there's two ways in which sex work can be either formal or informal. So the first way is when we're talking about economies. The formal economy is the regulated labor economy, which in terms of sex work would mean stripping is regulated. It's legal in certain ways. Camming, porn. And so these have different challenges and different access levels than informal economy sex work, which is generally what we're going to be focusing on today because it has more of a risk for infectious disease or just like more of a consideration for infectious disease prevention. And then the other way is what I was saying before is that some folks, formal sex work is when people recognize themselves as a sex worker and this is something they know themselves to be doing or talk about themselves as doing, whereas informal is when people are doing what they need to do to survive and it's not something that they see themselves as being a part of, which is going to gear how we work with them in any sort of micro-counseling setting or service setting. Next slide, please. So sex workers are men who have sex with men. they're people who have sex with other genders, they're transgender individuals, and they're people who use drugs. And why I included these particular people is because these are populations who the CDC has prioritized for infectious disease prevention. And although not explicitly named, sex workers fall into all of these categories and so should absolutely be prioritized. And I think in many ways it shows the ways in which they're stigmatized and not even be named yet, though there is a lot of disparity, especially when it comes to HIV, which I believe is the next slide. So this is for all of my data folks. And of course, I have to say a disclaimer here, which is that when we are working with a very large industry and an industry that is highly stigmatized and highly criminalized, it is very hard to get good data. And so I encourage folks to be really critical of the data that we're consuming. This is the best data that I could find, and I'm still pretty critical of it. So I've linked just about everything for you all, so you can go discover things for yourself. And a lot of times we have to look at like what segment of the trade we're talking about. But I did think that this was pretty good in terms of being able to talk about sex work and HIV. So our first statistic is that 20 to 40% of women who are at high risk of HIV infection, so the folks you are already working with, report having sex in exchange for money or drugs within the last year. Personally, I think that's low. That's self-reported. And then we also see that transgender sex workers are nearly 6 times as likely to be living with HIV than the general trans population, and 25 times as likely to be positive than the general population. And so one thing we really know is that when we talk about intersectional oppression and intersectional stigma, when people have compounding levels of barriers that they are navigating, that their HIV risk goes up and that their access to health services is even harder. And in Canada and Kenya, where we were able to get different data from, modeling shows that the elimination of sexual violence could avert 17 to 20% of HIV infections among sex workers and clients. I actually link a report later on in this slide from John Hopkins and Susan Sherman, which Alex, who's going to be presenting to us, works with, that actually shows a correlation here in the US between police presence and elimination of HIV infections. And so there's some really interesting stuff that's happening out there. And why we're talking about police is because there is a lot of police harassment and abuse of sex workers that can't go reported because this is, you know, our public safety system, and people get arrested all the time. They really have no recourse to report. And also, police frequently confiscate condoms as evidence of prostitution, and this can happen legally unless it is a law that it cannot. So New York passed a law probably about 6 years ago now that said no condoms as evidence. And this is going to be triggered differently in different cities or counties. But it could be anywhere between 3 and 10 condoms that if someone has can trigger a prostitution charge, which of course means that people may not be carrying condoms because they have to choose between arrest or infectious disease. And that's a really scary choice. And I know from some of the community-based research I've done here in Seattle that even today, people are reporting police taking and poking holes in their condoms. They might not be arrested, but all their condoms are taken, and then they are left with little recourse to be able to get through the night. So now they have to make money and have even less resources. So some scary data that I'm sharing with you all today. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about harm reduction, right, a lot of times we're recognizing that there are potential negative consequences to these activities. And I would argue that these are more so potential negative consequences of the socio-political response, the current response we're taking to these things. But either way, when we say harm reduction, what are the occupational health and safety concerns that we're talking about? So I already gave you some data for HIV, and we see that across all infectious disease profiles, sex workers have higher risk there. But what folks are actually most concerned about is violence prevention. And so we see in some studies that the top fatality for people in the sex trade is violence, followed by overdose. And this is why your drug user health programs are particularly well suited to gear specific services to this population, because that is the second fatality that people are experiencing. So we know a lot of folks in the sex trade are using drugs, a lot of people are using drugs or trading sex, and also a lot of people are experiencing violence, and that can be really hard to talk about when our services are so siloed and violence prevention isn't inherently happening along with HIV prevention, overdose prevention. And so that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today, is how to really intertwine a lot of these things. And it's also important to recognize, because I know the media bombards us with talking about like pimp and manager violence, client violence, which are absolutely real, but there's other sources of violence. Police, institutional harm is something that's really real, especially for folks who are under 18, peer and community, and then intimate partner violence is also really high. And again, this is a criminalized population that has very little recourse to be able to deal with these things through the ways, the only avenue really we give people to do that. So thinking about non-carceral approaches to violence is really important when we think through this. And because people have to deal with this level of stigma and criminalization, with trauma that comes from all sorts of different areas, and also navigating dual identities, there is higher levels of PTSD and mental illness in this population, which just kind of makes sense when you look at the right-hand column. And I actually linked this study because I think it's really interesting. I am really a big fan of entheogenic therapies. There's a lot of research that suggests that psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine are really helpful for stigmatized and criminalized populations, folks with addiction, folks with high levels of trauma, and that has been shown to be the case for sex workers with suicidality. Next slide, please. So why are we going to apply a harm reduction philosophy and a harm reduction approach to this? So this is where we really can look at the overlap between sex work and substance use, and why harm reduction is really well suited as an approach to both of these. I think I really appreciate that there's been a lot of information during the COVID-19 pandemic about what harm reduction looks like as an approach to COVID-19. We also know harm reduction is a really good approach to working with folks who are currently experiencing violence. And so there's many different ways that we can apply harm reduction. But in particular, when we talk about sex work and substance use, we're talking about a spectrum of behavior and experience, right? This is not one size fits all. One sex worker is just one sex worker, right? And we also know that abstinence or exit is not the goal for everyone, or not the goal for everyone right now, right? And that these are not what who a person are, they're what they do. It could be part of their identity, but really they have whole selves that we need to address and look at and allow them to bring. And a harm reduction framework is really great because it prioritizes autonomy, self-determination, and informed consent. And we know that these things are not always harmful. They don't have to be harmful. People have complicated relationships with them, and so we don't need to just cut them off, or if people want to, we can give them a variety of different resources, right? And so that's why harm reduction is a really just very well suited as an approach to working with sex workers who don't want exit or aren't ready for exit. Next slide, please. So now that we know that harm reduction is a great framework, let's talk about what that actually looks like. So what are the elements of that? I really appreciate that the Harm Reduction Coalition has put forward some principles of harm reduction as applied to drug use. And so these were adapted by Reframe Health and Justice to be applied to the sex trade. And I'm going to go through each one with you right now, because these are, I think, really important foundational elements to sex worker-centered harm reduction. So the first one is our neutrality principle, right? So it views trading sex for money and resources as neither inherently harmful or degrading, or inherently stabilizing or empowering. This can actually be really hard, right? Because I've trained some homeless service provision agencies, and I remember I had someone come up to me once and said, you know, I hear that you're saying that the sex trade isn't inherently harmful, but I work with all of these people, these like femmes in particular, who are just experiencing a lot of violence and really can't get a leg up. And my question was, have you worked with a femme experiencing poverty who has it, right? And so in a lot of ways, the closer we are to proximity, the closer we are in proximity to poverty, and in proximity to racism, the closer we are in proximity to violence and all of these things. And so we have to really kind of be able to look at what the problematic elements are. And similarly, I know a lot of folks who do sex worker rights organizing who you know, make a lot of money and only know people who do, and that's a very different experience. And so recognizing that a lot of times we only see kind of one piece of the puzzle per se, and so it's important to be neutral and recognize that we might not know it all. And also, sex worker-centered harm reduction focuses on who people are rather than what they do. It recognizes the myriad of reasons why people engage in the sex trade and seeks to help people meet goals as defined for themselves in non-judgmental and compassionate manners and atmospheres. This is the approach that we take, which is when someone comes to us and they are looking for housing or they're looking for a variety of different things, we don't just focus on their sex work or their drug use, right? It really gets to be defined by them. And this is really important because so many people have experienced just that, where they come presenting a bunch of different things, and people who say they're here to help just kind of hone in on what it is that they are doing, whether or not they view that as problematic for themselves or that is the thing they're presenting with. It recognizes the potential infectious disease and physical safety consequences associated with sex work, and it seeks to help people mitigate these factors. This is really important, right? Because we have to recognize that violence and exploitation and infectious disease exist. Not all sex work begins or ends or includes trafficking. I wrote a blog that you can get to through our website that talks about how exploitation in the sex trade is like overdose is to drug use, right? And so it is a potential negative consequence that does not have to happen and can happen to people, but doesn't can like absolutely inform their experience, but isn't like this kind of like thing that I think society makes it out to be. And so we have to recognize these things happen, but that there's a variety of other things that people are needing in the way. Next slide, please. Seeks to provide holistic support rather than isolated interventions. I know that you all are doing this and doing really well, so I'm excited to hear more from you all at the end of this. And number 6 is our kind of like advocacy principle of harm reduction. Highlights the impact that the criminal justice response to sex work has on people in the sex trade and seeks to eliminate socio-political barriers to care, safety, and general well-being. Understand stigma and its byproducts to be at the root of harm experienced by individuals involved in the sex trade, and that intersecting oppressions compound the harm. So this is really important because it really recognizes that a lot of harm that people are experiencing comes from the way that systems are set up right now. And that we can only help people so much, and we can only reduce infectious disease prevalence so much until we address those big barriers. And so for those of you who aren't able to do a lot of advocacy, really being able to understand how to support people who are doing it or how to be involved in coalition, because there's lots of different folks with lots of different great ability to do this, and so everyone gets to play their part. And then the final principle is that sex worker-centered harm reduction believes that incorporating a diverse range of sex workers into public health policies and discussions can be a gateway into community health, but it understands that one individual's experience does not equal that of all individuals in the sex trade. And this is something that drug user harm reduction has started to do really well, which is engage folks who are most impacted by the issues that we're working with, engage drug users, engage sex workers, help them lead your programs, resource the ones that are led by sex workers, especially sex workers of color, especially sex workers who have other marginalized identities. And so this is really recognizing that this is a vast trade and engaging a lot of different people. And so you all have heard enough from me. I wanted to set up some framework for this, some common language. Please know that NASDAD and Reframe pretty soon are going to be releasing a core competencies document of sex worker-centered harm reduction for you all that has been reviewed by a lot of these panelists. And so we're going to have some other kind of framing information for you. But really, I want to be able to introduce the amazing panelists that have showed up today that are doing amazing sex worker-centered harm reduction work in their communities. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this slide. Thank you, Kirsten. So of course, I want to show you that harm reduction is evidence-based for all you data folks. The Lancet and Harm Reduction International both have amazing papers and articles and data that shows that this is a really effective way of working with folks in the sex trade, a really good alternative to policing the sex trade and to exit-based services, or a good thing to go along the continuum of prevention and exit. And then Johns Hopkins University, this is what I had talked about before, that talks about the impacts of criminalization on the overall well-being of sex workers. It's a really amazing study, so I welcome you all to click on all of these links. So with that, I believe that it is great. Okay, it's a good time to introduce our first panelist. So I'm really excited. I met Phoenix probably like 2 years ago now when I was on the board of SWAP USA, and Phoenix has done a lot of amazing intersectional work. And so Phoenix, will you please introduce yourself and SWAP USA and tell us a bit about what SWAP is, what SWAP does, and all of that.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, awesome. So my name is Phoenix Kalita, and as Justice said, I am with SWAP USA. I am now on the staff. I used to be on the board back when, now I'm on the staff. And of course, our focus is to try to engage in harm reduction around sex workers. Nearly everybody who's involved is not just an advocate or ally of sex workers, but has engaged in sex work in the past. That's the vast majority of our staff and board. And so, we find that a lot of organizations are, designed to help sex workers, but because a lot of them don't necessarily have the direct interaction with sex workers or aren't coming from a harm reduction model, that sometimes they're not as successful in their outreach efforts. And so we thought it was really important to be able to serve communities that we are also a part of, and communities that we ourselves represent. And so that's really a really big focus on where SWAP is headed these days, not just in terms of basic outreach, but in terms of essentially doing community building and creating safe spaces for sex workers to be and discuss what the needs look like, what the community needs, how this is going to vary based on different marginalizations people face, whether that's based on gender or income, or whether it's somebody who is using drugs or is facing houselessness. So really trying to help the most vulnerable people within our community, because those are the members of our community that are least likely to be served, and we just really want to fix that. That's a problem. So I feel like you asked me something else that I didn't answer. I apologize.
Yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about your structure. I know you all just shifted structure recently, right? So we'd love to hear a bit about that.
We did. We actually have changed our structure a little bit. We now have a co-director model, and that's something that's very new. We've only been doing it for the last few months. And the idea behind that was, first of all, we don't want anything to be just sort of like unilateral top-down structure. We find it much more productive when it's more of like a horizontal structure, and we can, everybody gets an input, everybody has a say, nobody feels necessarily dictated to. And the other thing that I love about this current structure is that it really allows the people on staff to really focus into their sort of niches of what they do the best. And so everyone has a very specific tailored job description. And I think that's amazing, because then it gives this really great opportunity for folks to do exactly like the part that they excel in on the job. And so I'm really excited about that, just in terms of keeping everything as democratic as possible, but also allowing people to flourish on an individual level. So we're really excited about it. And we're getting new board members coming on in the near future as well. So I'm really excited that SWAP, we have a mission statement and we have a set of goals, and I'm really excited to see that the organization is now following through with those, as far as what leadership looks like in terms of demographics, what it looks like in terms of structure, what it looks like in terms of the work we can do. So I'm very excited right now with where SWAP is.
And how many chapters do you all have now?
The last time I looked, I believe we have 46 active chapters.
46 local active chapters. Awesome. Yeah, that's really
We're getting
cool.
a few more in a couple months too, so yay.
Yeah, so those are local chapters that folks can engage with. So we'll hear more about that. Thank you so much, Phoenix. And next, I would like to introduce Alex, who is with Spark Women's Center in Baltimore. Alex, will you tell us more about yourself and more about Spark and Spark's service model?
Hi, so I'm Alex. So I work for Spark, which is a non-men's center located in Baltimore, specifically in this neighborhood, Pigtown. So Spark is dedicated to offering comprehensive services at no cost to people who sell sex and people who use drugs. So kind of like we've been touching on earlier in the presentation, a lot of the time I find when I'm in harm reduction spaces, people seem to gravitate to one or the other. So I'm either with people who are talking about sex workers or I'm with people who are talking about drug use. And I think to myself, are these mutually exclusive? A lot of the sex workers I know also use drugs. A lot of the people I know who use drugs also sell sex or are involved in the sex trade in some way. So Spark is aimed at seeing people at the margins and meeting these specific needs, whether it's people who are just using drugs or just selling sex or any intersection therein, right? And we do that by offering safer sex supplies. So we offer condoms, personal lubricant, right? A lot of people don't know, but lube actually can make your sex safer because lube reduces friction, will help reduce micro tears, which is exposure to blood, all that kind of stuff. So we offer safer sex supplies. We also offer safer drug use supplies. So that looks like cookers, waters, right? A lot of the time people don't have water, and so they have to use like puddle water, which opens them to all sorts of infections. So we give people waters, patents, safer like straws for safer snorting, things like that. So we offer these services to people. We also don't just offer these sorts of like tangible services, these sorts of concrete tools that we also often associate, with harm reduction, but we also offer people space, right? A lot of the time, people are like working really, really hard, and they might be street-based and doing full-service sex work or whatever, but they don't have a lot of opportunities to like have this respite, this place to sit down and just be. And so something that I think is really great about Spark is that we don't just offer programs like art class, we don't just offer book club. We also, you want to come in, sit down, watch a movie for 10 minutes, take a breather, have a smoke, have some tea, that's cool. You want to sit with us for 3 hours? That's cool, baby. You know, we have people who come in from like the moment we open to like the moment we leave. And it's nice to see people and just be able to serve people, and at the risk of sounding redundant and harm reduction, meet people where they are. So people are often in the best position to determine what they need. And if they say, hey, you know what, I really need some cookers, I really need some stems, and I really need some condoms, cool, you got it. Or you know what, I'm like really tired, I kind of want to take a load off, could we watch Lilo and Stitch? Cool, you got it. So we're really, like I said, aimed at meeting people's needs and serving people at the margins who sell sex, who use drugs.
Yes, all right, Alex, just dropping the mic. And next, I'm excited to introduce you all to Shanae. Shanae is with the Chrysalis House and also a representative of the Rocky Mountain Sex Worker Coalition. So Shanae, will you please tell us more about yourself and the organizations you're involved with?
Absolutely. So my name is Shanae Adams, and I am one of the co-founders of the Chrysalis House. The Chrysalis House is a sex-positive collaborative based here in Denver. All of that to say is that we're basically a community resource center. And we do work with the Rocky Mountain Sex Worker Coalition, which is an umbrella that houses a lot of different sex worker organizations in Colorado, but it's also one of the first places that a lot of sex workers in Colorado turn to when they're looking for resources, when they're looking for support. And the Chrysalis House is a community resource center where we provide some of that support. Both me and my co-founder really created the Chrysalis House because we believe in the power of community and the fact that community is literally the treatment for everything. At the Chrysalis House, we have a food pantry, we have a clothing pantry, we've helped people secure housing, we've helped people secure funding so that way they can take care of medical illnesses, so that way they can take care of any other kind of life things that come up. I am also a licensed professional counselor candidate. So I host a lot of mental health opportunities to serve not only people in our communities, but we see a lot of sex workers come to us for help and support. I am a sex positive, kink positive, polyamorous person who has experience doing sex work. And I find that because of all of those backgrounds, a lot of people feel comfortable coming and seeking mental health services from us as well. We partner with a lot of other organizations in Colorado that help people who are existing in the margins, whether that be sex workers, whether that be people of color, whether that be LGBTQ folk identifying people. And we host different workshops to provide different information that may be really useful to those populations. Currently, we've had workshops on drug use and Narcan use. We have put together safe use kits. We have safer sex kits, and we support the people who actually go out on our strolls and deliver those kits, deliver those informations. And we act as kind of a hub for people to be able to come and group before they go out and they do that work. And we are currently just trying to make sure we show up for our community however they need, and really just being there to provide that community and that educational background. We host a monthly munch, which is a non-sexual place for kinky people and kinky interested people to come together and have conversations. And we get a lot of people who may not have especially seen themselves exist in those different communities. Kink being one of the main ones, especially like me and my co-founder are both Black queer femmes. And I, as a masculine of center person, am able to speak to the experience of existing in those bubbles with those intersecting identities. So we definitely bring a sex positive framework and intersectional lens whenever we go out to serve our community and provide some of those resources that they're turning to us for.
Right on. Thank you. So we're going to engage in some dialogue here for another like 10 to 15 minutes, so we can just kind of popcorn style this. And you all have already started to tell us some about what sex worker centered harm reduction means to you and how you do it or what it looks like in your area. So if there's anything else you want to talk about there. And I wanted to pair that with what are the issues, policies, or local practices that make harm reduction hard or actually perpetuate harm in your areas?
Sure. So one of the main things that we see is just the criminalization of sex work in the state of Colorado. I may be fudging a little bit on the number, but the state spends close to or a little bit over $1 million just taking sex workers through the criminal justice process, everything from arresting them, having them go through court cases, giving them to kind of divertment programs, or having them enrolled in drug treatment programs, or having them be enrolled in domestic violence or sex work or trafficking programs. And that $1 million is more or less going to waste because they're not addressing the main problem or the main issue that a lot of sex workers find themselves in. And a lot of them are coming from poverty, or they're coming from just the fact that the economy is kind of crap right now. So they're really just criminalizing the act that they're doing without putting any kind of forethought or pre-thought into how this person has found themselves in the position that they're in. And it's actually costing the city of Denver in particular a grip of money. And if we have been in talks with the city to be like, there are better ways to utilize this money. There's better ways to actually see less sex workers come through the criminal justice system if we were able to actually get to what the root of the problem is, and whether that be mental health, whether that be employment, whether that be housing, whether that be poverty. But as you mentioned earlier, it's really hard to find the statistics and get the data on that information because this act is criminalized. And if we were to move from a criminalized mindset to a decriminalized mindset, that would provide a lot of opportunity to build community, to help people stay a lot safer, and to save the city a grip of money.
As you had mentioned earlier, Justice Susan Sherman does a lot of really great work and has done a lot of really great work in research specifically about harassment and like this sort of police antagonism that street-based sex workers face. So not only do I invite, but I encourage everybody, if you're unfamiliar, to go out and check it out, especially folks who do love data. But I think a lot of the things that impact sex workers, right, and a lot of the things that these policies come from, is that we exist in a society that hates sex workers, right? We haven't moved that far from our country's like puritanical origins, right? We have a society that's like deeply, deeply predicated on punitivity, right? And punishing people at every turn, right? Institutionalizing those people. And so there's just like a deep hatred of sex workers that seeks to condemn them for selling sex, right? And so policies come from this place. And so I think it's really important we think about violence when we conceptualize violence, right? And we interrogate what violence means. It's not just like this interpersonal violence. I think a lot of the time people are inclined to talk about that as violence, recognize that, but it's like the structural systemic overarching framework that exists around us and like bears down on us at all times. And so sex workers are moving through this space where it's not just, as we mentioned, maybe they're facing violence from managers, or maybe they're facing violence from clients, right? But it's also the structural violence. It's being policed, right? It's being over policed. It's being antagonized by police. It's having an officer poke holes into your condoms so that you can't work, or if you are going to work, you have to compromise your safety. I remember a conversation I had with a particular client during outreach, because something that Spark does is outreach, where we go to strolls and distribute safer sex materials, safer drug use materials. And I'm talking to this person who is a sex worker, and she like beckons me closer. I'm like, okay, what's going on, babe? What do we need to do? And she tells me that she's lost drugs inside of herself because cops were patrolling the area and harassing her, and she had to hide them. So she had to make this decision like, okay, can I afford to go to jail? What's going to happen if I go to jail? Or am I going to put these drugs inside of myself? They subsequently were lost. And this is a problem that's created specifically by structural violence. The cop didn't have to come up to her and say, oh, give me your condoms, right? And that's something we know about violence, is even when it's not like present, it's in the room. That's how like oppressive forces work. They like bear down on us. So somebody doesn't even need to like invoke violence directly to invoke violence directly, right? So these are the things we're kind of moving around, but like we just have these models that are just predicated on hating sex workers, punishing them, not helping them. And we also have these really paternalistic, like saving sex workers things, right? That just ultimately end up in like stings and arrest. My feelings about the carceral state aside, I don't think that being arrested helps too many people, you know? So I don't know too many sex workers who have been helped by being arrested or antagonized by anybody, cops or otherwise. But yeah, at the risk of sounding redundant, people just have this particular sort of vitriol for people who sell sex, and they are not afraid to create harm and perpetuate harm for people who sell sex.
I appreciate.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to add something that I see a lot, because we try to keep in touch with our chapters, you know, because I'm with SWAP National, and something that I see that actually makes it harder is how different policies are in place in different areas. Because something I've seen a lot of times is we'll have a call with folks from across the country who are really invested in saying, okay, we did this worked really well here, this was a great form of harm reduction, this is how we did it. And then even though they're willing to give this information and provide examples of how to do certain things, it just may not work in another part of the country. And I think that's like also a discussion about like, obviously, yes, things like police are going to be police, like that's universal. Sex worker policies are made to hurt sex workers, that's relatively universal. But when it gets into, you know, the somewhat like more specific details of different policies and different plans and implementations, I think it's also really important to bring to that discussion how, you know, something that's happening in Seattle may be very different than what's happening in Dallas, which is very different than Chicago, which is nothing like Baltimore. And so I think a lot of times we get caught up in like getting really excited, like, oh, we found a thing that works, this is amazing, let's do this thing everywhere. And it's like, it may not work in this state, or it may not work in this county. And so I think also like keeping in mind that in order to keep these policies fresh and up to date and protecting people, we really need to keep being creative about what we're doing, just to make sure that things are as accessible to everyone as we can make them, because some stuff just isn't going to work in some places. And unfortunately, like that's really you know, just something that we need to discuss. And so, you know, we actually just had a call, and one state in particular, a bunch of people were reporting that, you know, police were targeting sex workers who they knew, you know, were positive. And it's just like, but that's not what's happening here, right? Other places are doing this, you know, we're trying to be nice to the sex workers and view them as victims. And so like, you know, people are fighting very different battles at very different times. And so, yeah, we just gotta, I know I feel like I'm nagging about it, but we really got to bring that into the conversation, because it's just wild from state to state how much things can vary.
I also think, if I can rip off you for a second, Phoenix, it's not just bound to policy, right? But the sentiment and culture that's set in different areas around sex work is very different. I used to work at HITS, which is another harm reduction organization that serves the needs of sex workers and drug users in DC. And DC and Baltimore are like very close. right? They're like 45 minutes apart, but even just the sentiment and the culture around how we think about drug use is very different. DC is like a obviously very politically driven city, but a lot of the regard people have for sex workers comes from this very like liberal mindset. And so people are like, okay, well, there's like a condom on the playground and my kid can't play because there's condoms on the ground. And if you can say, okay, well, it sounds like you're dealing with issues of like unwanted condoms. What if we petition to put more trash cans in your neighborhood? Do you think that would help, you know, work through the problem? And people say, okay, yeah, you know, that works, right? And something that was really great about HITS is that people knew them, and because they've been established for so long. So I remember one call, someone was like, listen, we're like right by a school. There's like a stroll right by us. We like don't want to confront these people. We want sex workers to be able to sell sex, but like there's like kids here. So how do we work through that? We're like, okay, cool. We'll work through it. We'll do it, right? And then in Baltimore, there's this very different, really conservative approach that's just like, yeah, sex work is bad. You know, insert slur here. You're a bad person. That's bad. Don't sell sex. That's much more difficult to push back on. If I can say, hey, here's some trash cans, that's fine. I can work through that. I can metastasize that problem. If you think sex workers are bad people, that's like a much longer, multifaceted conversation with many more steps, right? I can't force someone to unlearn bias they have about sex, patriarchal values, certainly not that easily, not as easy as it is to suggest a trash can gets put in your neighborhood, right? But just like I said, the sentiment that exists even in places that are 15 minutes apart is very varied, and that's something we also have to reconcile with.
Thank
And
you all
even
so much for. I'm going to just gear the conversation a bit because I think we've had a really good discussion about stigma and about the harms of the criminal legal approach. And so here we are with public health, you know, officials in a lot of ways, a chance to take a different approach. And my one of my business partners, Kate Diadamo, often says, so far we've seen that the public health approach to sex work has really not been all that much less harmful, right? Like let's look at the brothel model of legalization in Nevada, where folks are held against their will after being tested. And even if someone is on treatment for HIV and virally suppressed or has received treatment, it has no viral load for hepatitis C, can't work. Archaic, right? And so let's talk a little bit about your experiences working with public health departments or HIV prevention programs, or what your hopes are to do this public health model right, because there's a lot of opportunity here, and these are our allies, and these are folks who want to do well. And so what do you all have to say to them?
I'm Becky Tahablu. I am Shanae's partner with the Chrysalis House, and I wanted to address, in Denver, we have an ordinance where sex workers can obtain, or an escort can obtain a license, and to maintain that license, they have to get tested every 3 to 6 months. That is not autonomy for their body. So in concepts of sex work being decriminalized, I would like to see autonomy for a worker's body. We do not ask people in other forms of labor to be tested and require them to have certain things taken care of their body in order to work. Are you understanding what I'm saying? It's only once they get sick are we asking them to become tested. So I would like to see something along those similar lines. If we're looking for autonomy, that's what I would ask, is to be treated as any other laborer versus to be vilified beforehand as a sex worker.
Yes, unfortunately, the rights of laborers and workers are constrained in so many ways. It does suck, especially for sex workers. I think I'd really like to see people divest from this, as I mentioned earlier, this patriarchal, paternalistic, like, oh, let's save sex workers. Like, people don't really need to be saved. Sometimes people need help, right? And we can help people access services. But this like savior model doesn't really do any favors. Like savior complexes, they actually like don't ever help anybody. Jot that down. Like they don't we want anybody of service, right? And they deny people's agency, they deny people's autonomy, they deny people's humanity, right? If someone says, hey, I really need condoms, I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna save you. You're in so much danger, don't worry, I can rescue you. Like I didn't ask you to rescue, I asked you for condoms. So you like got the condoms or not? Because I just condoms, is that cool? You got them, right? And so I'd really like to see people move away from just trying to save people. As I mentioned earlier in my introduction, people are often in the best position to know their own needs and communicate their own needs. And so when we do the savior model kind of BS, we rob people of that, right? We deny that of them. And it's much more important to say like, hey, how can I meet you where you are? What do you need from me? Is it something that I can provide? Do you need comprehensive testing, right? Do you need an HIV test? How can I give you that? How can I help you access that? Do you need to take a shower? How can I help you access that, right? And moving away from this like judgmental, like, oh my God, you sell sex and you use drugs? Well, actually, using drugs can help you towards your goals, right? If I'm on a stroll late at night and I need to stay up, cocaine might help me stay up. That's like helping me achieve my goals, right? So you like saving me from the drug use. How am I gonna stay up? I can't stay up now. You can help me? You didn't do anything, right? So I think moving away from this like prescriptive idea of like, oh, I know best, I'm gonna save these people, right? As you mentioned, this exit, right? And the same thing happens with people who use drugs. As much as I love harm reduction, so I manage Spark's social media. I follow the tag harm reduction, and a lot of the posts that people make, you like scratch the surface. I'm like, that's not harm reduction. Getting people to be sober, that's something different. Like sobriety is great if people choose it, but like leading people ultimately to choose sobriety, trying to direct people to ultimately leave the sex trade. If people want to leave the sex trade, cool, let's help them. But not everybody wants to do that. A lot of people are able to meet their goals through doing sex work, right? And I don't want to invisibilize the complicated nature of sex work or say like everyone's having a great time, everyone's peachy keen, nobody's having problems. But there are a lot of people who say like, listen, I can't work a 9-to-5 job, I can't stand on my feet for 10 hours a day, but sex work allows me to manage my own schedule. This really works for me. So I think just really meeting people where they are, and like I said, moving away from like, I know best, I'm gonna teach you and I'm gonna help you. Just listen, just keep your ears open.
I think even to the point that you made, Alex, and the point that Becky was making is that there is this idea of we know what sex workers need. We know what people need. And I think a lot of the kind of on one aspect is we have people who are in power who don't know these experiences, who haven't experienced what it is to be a person who's on the street trying to get their next fix, or a person who's on the street trying to figure out how to take a shower, or where they're going to eat, or even where they're going to sleep that night. And so we have people who have never had that experience trying to come up with this list of ideas and plans and things to do. On the other hand, even when services are created and are available, I think there's a lot of mistrust that still happens in terms of the government and still happens in terms of the medical field, where I, as a sex worker, am not going to come to your organization to ask you for condoms, to ask you for safe needles, to ask you for blah, 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 because there's the very real possibility that the police are going to be lurking there. There's the very real possibility that the report, the data that you're going to collect is going to be used against me. There's a very real possibility that my story, my circumstances, my experience is going to be skewed, and it's not going to be articulated to whomever entity you're going to send it to. And it makes it really difficult to try to approach people and say, hey, I want to help you, when you don't know what I need and I don't trust you enough to tell you what it is that I need. So I think one of the main things that I would ask for when it comes to public health is to have people who have experience in these environments. Like I have experience as a sex worker and I am a therapist, and that's why a lot of sex workers come to me for therapy. I know several sex workers who have PhDs in whatever field, who have knowledge about how to actually impact these populations in a way that is going to serve and help these populations. And it's getting over the respectability politics that exists to actually allow the gatekeeping that exists to actually allow these people into environments where they can make decisions that actually create change.
And I think it's also important to understand that that mistrust is founded, right? People have a distrust of institutions for many, many reasons, because of personal experiences, because of generational experiences, right? And when I say that, I'm talking about like medical bias that exists and has existed as long as the medical industrial complex has been around, right? And so I had a particular interaction at Spark. I do this syringe program, and someone comes in and they're very like skittish And I was like, is everything all right? You know, what's going on? And she said, you know, I had wanted to come here 3 weeks ago, but I was really worried. You know, I have like a warrant out and I just didn't want you to call. I'm like, listen, I'm not going to call the police. I'm not in the business of calling the police on my clients. No one here is, least of all me, you know, but that's something that we have to work around, right? And that's another thing. Not everybody is going to even come in the room to tell you, hey, I'm afraid to come in the room, right? These are just things, people are just not coming because of this mistrust, because of white coat syndrome. Is that what it's called, where you mistrust like doctors, right? And so even having this opportunity to talk to someone who says, hey, I didn't come here for 3 weeks because I have a warrant. Now that's a rare opportunity, right? And so there are all these people whose needs are not being met, who are not being served because of these things. And unfortunately, I think some people are inclined to like condemn, like, oh, well, why wouldn't people help themselves? There are legacies of violence against Black people, against women, against trans people that exist within the medical industrial complex, like I mentioned, that make it very difficult for people even to want to come into this space, right? I love my job, but it's Johns Hopkins. That name means a lot of things in many different ways to many different people. I think we all know Henrietta Lacks, right? And that's just one thing. That's something that I have to work around. That's something that's impacting how I can do my job, right? And for me to be like, oh, why are sex workers not coming in? There's very valid reasons. I don't really like the word valid, but there's very valid reasons people aren't coming in, right? And we have to be mindful of those things. And that's why it's so important, as Shanae said, to put people who have lived experiences in here. So it's not this like top down, again, paternalistic, well, I'm not a sex worker, but I know sex workers because I work with them and I have my MSW. Okay, but what does that mean, right? How do I know that you care about sex workers? So it's important to have people who also have lived experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I find a lot of times that when people get really deep into the sort of savior complex, there's like a level of arrogance behind it, because there's always this like underlying assumption that like, because this isn't the choice I made, or this isn't the choice I would make, I inherently know better than the people who are living it, which is a really bizarre kind of place to come from. Because it's like, if you've never lived this, how could you possibly know better? How could you possibly know what's best? How could you possibly tell somebody, you know, what they should or shouldn't do? But a lot of people really do get that smug sort of attitude of like, oh, well, I never had to live like those people, you know, and all of a sudden that gives you this sort of freedom to go into this like straight on savior complex. Like, well, if I was able to avoid it, it's because I'm better than you. So let me tell you what you need. And so like, I really wish, you know, when we talk about destigmatizing things, when we talk about, you know, these sort of savior complexes, that folks would really interrogate themselves when you're going to get into this work and be like, why are you doing this work? Like, who are you serving? Your ego? Or are you here to serve a community? Like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And, you know, I think a lot of people, even though they think they mean well, really haven't unpacked that sort of internal baggage of thinking like, well, maybe I do feel like I'm in a better position to tell someone because I'm more objective, because I'm on the outside of it, because I never had to live that way, because I found an alternative way that, you know, this person couldn't find. But those things don't make you better as a person. It just makes you somebody who has a different lived experience. That doesn't make you better than anybody else. You know what I mean? And so like, I really, you know, want that to be a core part of this conversation when we come, you know, to talking about destigmatizing, when we talk about, you know, how to engage with these communities. I mean, the lived experience is fantastic and amazing, and it will certainly help folks open up to you sooner, but you don't have to have that, but you still need to be genuine in your attempts. And your attempts need to be about making things the best you possibly can for the people that you're working with, not the best for you, yourself, or your ego, or however the fuck you sleep at night, or whatever you do, right? That's not the focus. And so I just, you know, really always, I know I nag about certain things. This is one of those things that I'm always like, let's talk about that. So
So thank you. And I think that, so we've opened up for questions. So please, if you have questions, type them in the chat, and they're being funneled to me to ask you all. But I feel like this question actually rolls really well off what you just said, Phoenix. So we had someone ask, would it be more or less liberating to use Sylvia Federici's idea that the heteronormative relationship and economic structures mean that more women and all folks fall under the economic definition of trading sex for money, shelter, safety, etc.?
I think, go ahead, Phoenix.
No, you can go ahead first.
Oh, I think that sometimes people conflate these discussions of like sex work with transactional sex, and sometimes I think it's just helpful to use the term transactional sex to refer to what happens. Like there are obviously many people who are exchanging sex for specific things who may not consider themselves to be sex workers. And I also wouldn't necessarily call them sex workers because I think that evokes a particular relationship to the sex trade, right? But like I said, I do like the term transactional sex to talk about things like this, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, my person asked, would it be more liberating to view it that way? Is that what they said? Is, I guess, what does liberating mean in this context? Like liberating to who, what does that look like? You know, I think there's a lot of conversations about what liberation looks like. Are we talking about like destigmatizing, but folks are still in a position where they have to maybe engage in trading sex when normally they wouldn't want to? Like, is that still liberating? Not necessarily. You know, is it? Yeah, I just think we maybe need more of a definition of liberation here, because like this can go a lot of ways.
Yeah, I was gonna ask for a clarification on who. Like, are you asking this question as a person who doesn't have this experience? Are you giving us this question from a person who's asked this to you? It's kind of really difficult to speak to what may be liberating for a grand population when I don't know the back context.
I'm just going to speak it. I don't know if you can hear me. Can I be heard?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to speak it like this. The name of the law when it comes to prostitution is the Man's Law, MANN, or the White Slavery Act. This was not written for Black femmes. It was never intended for Black femmes or anybody that had been happened to present as femme or of color. So nothing in that law would be liberating for me as I identify today.
Thank you. I mean, there's so much history there. So thank you for bringing that, Becky, because we know that the war on drugs is racist, and we see those same racist drug war mechanisms that are being replicated in the war on sex trafficking, which is really a war on sex workers, and in particular, sex workers of color and sex workers of trans experience. And so I feel like this panel could go on forever. I really want to hear so much more from all of you, but we are restricted some by time. And so thank you so much for everyone who has joined us today. I feel like I have so many more questions still. So here you have some of our contact information to be able to engage with us. I also wanted to leave you all with some resources here. These are our organizations. Also, St. James Infirmary has a really good occupational health and safety guide, which is kind of a how-to, just about the only how-to that exists right now. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the drug user health TA to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Justice, and thank you, Alex, Phoenix, Shanae, Becky as well. I agree. I could have a webinar like this every day with you all because I learned so much, and yeah, I just really, really appreciate your labor and your time and being here with us today. And I do encourage people who wrote questions or comments that didn't get answered in this time to reach out to any of the panelists or to the drug user health team. We can kind of direct your question to the right person. I want to take 2 minutes to say that, again, this webinar was hosted by NASTAD's National Harm Reduction TA Center. This is a new effort funded by the CDC. And what we are looking to do is working with both health departments as well as community-based programs, really build capacity around harm reduction in all sorts of areas. So obviously we're talking about both sex work and drug use. I really appreciate this discussion around violence prevention as harm reduction. And we do this in a variety of ways, providing technical assistance, workforce development, training, consultation on program planning and design, on funding and grant writing, policy analysis, etc. So you can get in touch with us through our email, druguserhealthtA@nastad.org. There are a few other mechanisms for receiving technical assistance depending where you work. So if you work in a state, territorial, or CDC-funded jurisdictional health department, or a CDC-funded CBO in the US South, so any of those things based on the South, you can request assistance through the capacity building, CDC TA request platform. If you're working in CDC-funded hepatitis programs, we have the HepTac platform, where our hepatitis team, as well as our drug user health team, can provide assistance. And then finally, if you're working in a community-based or health department-run SSP or drug user health program anywhere in the US, you can receive assistance through the National Harm Reduction TA Center from us and our partners at AIDS United. And that's it for us today. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you again to Justice, Phoenix, Becky, Alex, Shanae, our wonderful presenters, and I hope you all have a lovely evening.